Hi, I'm Mrs. Beth Finney. My husband and I moved down to KMBC in 1972, but then we moved up here in about 1977, where I became a piano teacher. But then in 1983, just before Swauger died, I started working in the ad building as a bookkeeper for 25 years, and I had the privilege of working with many special people, Miss Swartwout, uh, Mrs. Paulo, Mrs. Major, and the Neihofs. And I've got a story to tell about them. Okay, in the 1980s, this is about Mrs. Paulo. In the 1980s, we decided we needed to go computer like the rest of the world. So my brother set us all up and trained us, but he was very concerned about Mrs. Paulo because she was elderly. She was in her late 60s, and he just didn't know if she'd be able to do that after, at such an elderly age. Now I think that's young. Anyway, she ate that stuff up. She just loved the computer and said if she'd had that all these years, how many letters she could have turned out in just a jiffy. She typed each one by hand, of course, for all those years. So she was brilliant, and she would come over and work early in the morning and all day, and she was a really hard worker. Mrs. Major kept the student accounts by hand, and she would answer the phones every day and do other things. But one day it had been such a hectic day in the office, and she went home. She was exhausted. And so she fixed her supper, and she sat down to eat, and she bowed her head, and she said, Mount Carmel High School. She was still answering the phone. She kept pictures on her desk of her children and her grandchildren, and she just loved to show them off to all the visitors. Well, a former student told me later, her dad was not a Christian when he put them in school here. And when Mrs. Major showed him those pictures, he thought, well, they're human. They love their families. I think my children are going to be okay here. Miss Swartwout loved life, and she loved people. She called me her beloved enemy. She lived to be 103. Yes, she lived to be 103. I heard her lament to Mr. Neihof one day. Mr. Neihof, around here we live clean and we live forever. I love Miss Swartwout's sense of humor. She was always had a lot of life in her. Mr. Swauger didn't actually work in the office, of course, but he worked everywhere on campus. He was overall smart. You all know all about that. He always saw the humorous side of life. He never had any biological children, but he was great with all the campus children. He loved the campus children. And our children, of course, we lived right above him, and our kids he was like their grandpa, like he was to all the campus kids. And the campus kids thought Swauger could do anything. One day, Marie was probably around 3 years old, and she was putting her shoes and socks on, and she said, oh, Mama, I got a hole in my sock. That's okay, Swauger can fix it. He loved that story, that she thought Swauger could do anything. The Neihofs, I love to hear them laugh. They had such big laughs. They loved God, they loved people. Mrs. Neihof was my mentor. She was about 10 years ahead of me in raising children. One thing about Mrs. Neihof I did not like. When she was going through a hard time, it made me sad, but I admired. When she was going through a hard time, which being the head of KMHA and Mount Carmel, of course, she would have many hard times. She would start singing while she was working, and she was encouraging herself in the Lord. She did that so many times, and it just always made my heart hurt, and yet I admired her at the same time for being encouraging herself in the Lord. It was a good example to me. This is about a current person, Quincy Murphree. When we got our computers, a lot of you know Quincy Murphree. He helped teach us some things. I could not get the hang of the mouse. And he worked with me. He said, Beth, I think you are the worst clicker I have ever seen.